I'm just going to jump right into it because I have a billion slides to show you, and I'm real excited to get into this topic. And I do want to start, to bring it totally up to date, with a quote from Henri Bergson from, I think, 1900, which is so appropriate to what's going on today. Comic fancy is indeed a living energy, a strange plant that has nourished on the stony portions of the social soil until such time as culture should allow it to vie with the most refined products of art. So I think we're starting to see some of the fruits of that right now. So it hasn't gone unnoticed that the art of most of the so-called imagists, the moniker now that seems to be used most often to describe the various self-named groups of Chicago-based artists that emerged in the mid-1960s, contains a lot of, well, let's just say, content. In other words, it is rich in its presentation of materials, color, images, and words that generate narrative possibilities, cultural criticism, political commentary, sexual politics, and humor. While each artist who falls under the moniker of imagism is unique, there are some who, especially in their earlier endeavors, tackle similar subject matter and share a lot of content, including humor. And that humor is undeniably of the oddball, off-kilter sensibility, and furthermore, in some of these artists, is a massively male sense of humor. Now, it may seem a convenient argument is, well, why wouldn't there be such a male sense of humor in the works by the two classic Harry Who artists, Jim Nutt and Carl Worsom, whom I'm mostly dealing with? They are men, after all. But it is possible to be a man and present a very different style of humor that isn't the humor usually associated with the male sense of humor. Namely, the jokey, adolescent, scatological, grunting, panting, demonstrative, vulgar, even foul type of humor we can all easily recognize in today's movie, TV, and other popular cultural offerings, or even your average beer commercial. So I just want to introduce Jim with an early work called Broad Jumper. Jim Nutt and Carl Worsom were both born in the late 1930s. Jim in 1938, Carl in 1939. So as yet unborn during the Great Depression, they likewise were too young to remember much of the World War II years. Yet the context of grim historical actuality and frivolous popular culture was amazingly consistent from the 1930s through the Cold War years, which would demark the period in which the youthful shaping of these men would have taken place. And the years Nutt and Worsom would have been adolescent, the times were well described by former Chicago reader and current New York Times film critic Dave Kerr. And this is Dave. In the mid-1950s, America witnessed a great explosion in popular culture, fueled by new prosperity and new technologies. And with that explosion, television, comic books, long-playing records, remember those, and widescreen movies, was born an extraordinary generation of artists who are best known as satirists. Their targets were not the traditional ones of sex, politics, or the foibles of their fashionable entertainments, but the cliched content of entertainment itself. All these pioneering humorists and many others realized that the real world mattered less to people than the sea of sounds and images that the ever more powerful mass media were pumping into American lives. And just to introduce Carl Worsom, we'll be looking at him more later, of course, too. These satirists, as Kerr labels them, undoubtedly include Nutt and Worsom, and by exploring the popular culture of their formative years, the various comedic and graphic tropes that inform their colorful, even lurid works are revealed. It is also valuable to note the work of artists who were emerging at roughly the same period in cities other than Chicago, particularly Peter Saul and Robert Arneson, and I'll just examine them a little bit at the end of this talk, to contextualize the rich and the unique flowering of Nutt and Worsom's Harry Who periods 1966 to 1969. Now, this great explosion in popular culture included stand-up comedy, especially the savagely funny and vulgar work of Lenny Bruce, the flowering of inventive, irreverent comedy troupes such as the pioneering stream of consciousness Firesign Theater, the proliferation of low comedy as featured in Mad Magazine, which was founded in 1952, and its later knockoff Cracked, which gives my lecture its title, the splashy and often sardonic posters for film noir, horror, and other movies, the campy, raucous imagery pumped out for advertising, and the hysterically pitched pulp detective and science fiction magazines with their dramatic, exaggerated covers, and we'll see a lot of elongated limbs, as Sue Ellen was pointing out. But before this examination can take place, I want to speak more about humor. You know, there really isn't much about the topic of humor in visual arts literature. That's our being here today. But I found this helpful guide in an online guide to teaching Shakespeare to high school students that I actually think the presentation this afternoon will get more into the actual nature of humor. People often look to comedy as a form of entertainment and escape, but slapstick comedy aside, a genuinely humorous text, even something as seemingly flippant or inane as the script for an episode of The Simpsons, is of the same substance as those novels and plays which are considered the richest, most studied, and timeless works of art and literature. Humor reveals life's seriousness, complexity, and horror as much, if not more, as it does life's absurdity and lightness, especially as one moves further from the place and time and culture of its creation. Consequently, it is through a study of humor that students can most easily and enjoyably begin to recognize what it means to be a trenchant reader, a deliberate and poetic writer, and a devoted observer of human nature, as so many of the artists we are seeing today, sensitive to the nuances of language and to the extent to which literature presents a challenge or perpetuation of social stereotypes and norms. A study of humor also invites increased attention to the complexity of human emotions, their elicitation in others via writing, and the very diverse range of motivations, ideas, and agendas that lie behind the evocation of laughter in response to various situations. Laughter can come as quickly out of nervousness or disdain as it can when one recognizes common flaws, sees foolish behavior, or notices amusing idiosyncrasies. It can express joy, lightness, understanding, and camaraderie, affirmation that someone's banter is appreciated and in good spirit, or it can carry hatred, disgust, anxiety, or a bitter and cynical satire. And that cynical and bitter satire, I think, is what I'm kind of focusing on with our satirists, as we say. Now, I've sort of dissolved this down to an image of Nancy from the Ernie Bushmiller's comic strip, which has been deemed by experts in the field of comic strips as probably one of the first culture icons, influencing many, including our artists here today, with its blatantly surreal visions. This comic strip, featuring the ubiquitous girl with the spiky comma-shaped hair and period-shaped eyes, or dots for her eyes, was wildly successful, despite having no humor whatsoever. Well, I kind of disagree with that assessment, but at any rate, Ernie Bushmiller refined and simplified his drawing style over the years to create a uniquely stylized comic world. The small size of the reproduction, despite that, both in Nancy cartoons, both the art and gag are clear. And an eye-tracking survey that some scholar did on Nancy comic strips determined that Nancy was so conspicuous it was the first strip that most people looked at on a newspaper comics page. In other words, the Nancy strips were eye-catching, which of course very well describes our artists at hand. So here we're seeing Toot Toot Woo Woo again, which Sue Ellen talked about, and I'm not going to go into great depth to analyze any of the symbolism of this work because I really want to immerse you more in the popular culture of the time that I believe these artists were influenced in some of the visual tropes that you see. But I do want to reveal what was so wonderful to learn when I did put this up at the MCA is kind of what goes on the back of this piece. Because as Sue Ellen pointed out, there's a lot of humor, especially in the words, the puns and the other types of little treasures that you find in the backs of so many of these works. So Hold Me Tight. Now, that looks like a rubber blow-up doll, maybe, being escaped because she was squeezed too tightly. But it is actually instructions to the art handler. Hold the work of art tight. So Toot Toot Woo Woo, here's the title, which is written carefully in self-designed lettering on the back of this piece. And you see the little shoes on the T's. So that's the way he titles it. And then, again, more instructions to art handlers, which, from what I understand, Jim learned from H.C. Westerman, who always put instructions on the bottom of his sculptures. So T and T, which is Toot and Toot, winning ways. And rebuses and puns like this are very common in Jim's work. For 10 1/2 pounds, so, spelled S-E-W, take it easy. Now again, this is telling you how much the painting weighs and to take care of it because it could get easily broken, as you can see from that damage that's happening there. Rock hitting the plexi. And another piece, Her Face Fits, which isn't particularly funny, I don't think, but again on the back we see so many little wonderful visual puns that only art handlers normally would see, including down here at the bottom a representation of Jim, in that there's a bolt that goes through the work. That's an actual bolt, I believe, and then the nut is framed out with actually a hand-drawn nut, and then there's a little scar there that's been all bloodied up so that you know that if you drop this thing, not only will it get hurt, you will too. But just the kind of, the titles, Nose Jam, you know, the kind of blatant cartoony look of these things is just, you know, undeniably graphically interesting. And the, again, punning titles. But what I'm so interested in this particular work, Misty Garment from 1967, is the kind of tattoo thing that happens all over the face of this strange person. I think we'll have more discussion about this piece later on by another presenter. And all the little, you know, details that you see that come from the back of comic books and all these sort of little ads, and I'll be showing you more of those later, with just strange little body parts floating around, lots of underwear and girdles and bodily fluids and bananas that you're slipping on right and left. But also a lot of emphasis on feet. And we've seen, see that toe thing there up at the top, we've seen in Sue Ellen's presentation a lot of shoes and feet. And for those of you who don't understand what that thing is, it's one of those toe separators if you have bunions, which I was very delighted to be able to find a comparative for you. And then a piece that's actually not called Johnny Was It, even though it looks like it might be. It's called A Hee-Haw. And you can see the graphic style so much either consciously or unconsciously adapted from the popular cultural images of the day in the 40s and 50s. Here we have a lot of different Dick Tracy characters. And Dick Tracy was so famous for coming up with all these very distorted faces that represented the different crime figures or the good guys in his work. And I know that Dick Tracy was very important to the imagist, or so I should say actually the Harry Hu artist, because this piece was actually on view in a show at the MCA held in 1975 called Made in Chicago, Some Resources. And the artists who were put together into a show that traveled from the Sao Paulo Biennial were presented at the MCA and invited to do a ancillary exhibition called Some Resources, where they brought in all their sort of inspirational objects and their favorite sorts of things. And here is the page that this comic book was open to in this show, and it's Vitamin Flintheart's Wedding to Snowflake Falls. So you see that these comic book characters have these really interesting names that certainly Carl exploits a lot. And what's so important about this particular strip is it's a a June-January match that the fellow is quite elderly, and he's got this young chickie, Snowflake Falls. So they got married in this strip, and I think that was a very interesting thing because so many of the Harry Who artists were kind of married to one another. And then that just general macho quality, which comes out in comic strips particularly, and then this work, He-Man, which shows the big bulging superhero kind of chest. But I suspect this is also somewhat an homage to Cliff Westerman, who did his self-portraits and looked a lot like that. And then just to compare Carl and Jim, this is one of Carl's really wonderful drawings from very early on, 1970, called Cutting My Eye Tooth, where the mouth there is in the middle of the face. And, so it's a visual pun, and the title is a pun. And it's also very grotesque and satiric about, the body. And then the detail out of A Hee Haw, I've dropped the yellow frame away from it. And I've looked at this face for I don't know how long, and I keep thinking there's something wrong with the eyes there. So through the magic of, PowerPoint, I turn that eye upside down. I'll have him wink at you for a while. And I can't tell if does it look better that way? This is the way it really is. Should be. The way Jim painted it. But I also then realized, oh boy, so much of the stuff really looks like all these little ads in the back of the magazines. The imitation vomit, with this disgusting image, but it's an amazing joke to, place by baby, dog, dinner table, or pretend you've been sick. A most revolting, dirtiest trick we've seen. So this is from one of those back of the comic book pulp magazine kind of ads that those of us who are of a certain age certainly recognize. But I also did find this wonderful illustration from a letter that Jim wrote to Don Baum in 1969, where Jim was expressing his feelings about something that made him sick. So he just drew a little puke image there. And then this piece, which is in the Whitney collection called She's Hit, which is, Jim, don't be insulted, I don't think it's your best effort ever, but it's wonderfully interesting painting. And we'll look at a little more detail here at the top with that slit mouth thing going on, which is very odd and weird. And this is basically a form of entertainment that we're seeing here because someone's throwing knives at this creature. And in fact, this creature has got a fork stuck in it there, which is a wonderful pun. And then you're sort of, whoops, sorry. I'm trying to hit two things at the same time here. Your little He-Man, glamour guy there, which is in the middle of the belly. And what my favorite part about this piece is, Jim, I don't know if you know this, the Whitney has put it up on their beta website as for kids. And you get to draw a form and based on your perception of the forms in there, and then you get to put your height in inches in there, and it will automatically figure out your scale compared to the scale of the painting, so you could potentially think how big it will loom in front of you if you ever go to the Whitney and see it on display. And there's Jim in 1968, I believe, at the Hyde Park Art Center. Haven't changed a bit, Jim. But you don't look real happy. So we'll quickly go through some Carl images right now, lip balm, and just the distortion of the figure, comes from a deep place in these artists, but also some of these things that's an earring. We'll see later on, it looks like something else, but the kind of smushed faces, that patterning, that fragmentation that you see so often in comic strips. One of Carl's best early works, Screaming Jay Hawkins, which is at the Art Institute. This piece, I always thought, well, he's a blues musician, and it's so distorted and so weird and just so over the top that, it's got to be just Carl's vibrant imagination, which it is in part. But this is what Screaming Jay Hawkins looked like. So I think it's a kind of realistic portrait. You could see he has a snake around his neck there. And again, showing Click, and I didn't know that whole story. Although now I recognize you, Laurie, it does kind of look like you. And I knew you wore those ponytails, which was interesting. But what really gets me about this are these claw, pitchfork-like arms there. And also the graphic style of hiding this title and almost can't be read in the midst of the composition. And then a untitled work, I believe, that was made for Playboy when Carl was doing some illustrations for them of this, dominatrix with that, again, that, Dick Tracy kind of hairstyle. And you can see these two works, one by Carl and one by Jim. Just look at the hair, and the way that is handled is really very much coming out of comic books. And then just to see this whole Dick Tracy thing in a lot more detail, and we have the collector who owns these works here today, and maybe you can tell us more about them later, but apparently what I understand is that Carl wanted to enter this Draw Dick Tracy contest when the originator of the Dick Tracy comic book retired. That was Chester Gould, right? And so this is a self-portrait of Carl drawing these variations on the positively last entrant to the Draw Dick Tracy contest, which these were done after the contest would have closed, I believe in 1970 it was. And there's 4 different variations here, and you can just see some of the amazing creativity of this artist using these comic strip tropes. And here's Carl. This is from the Elmhurst collection. This is a photo taken by Sandra Jorgensen, who was a major donor. And he's surrounded by all those little toys, and I think he's probably pouring himself some Bosco or something, or I'm not quite sure. This, I think, is made in the 70s, this picture. And just to, again, contextualize how important all the stuff that you're going to be seeing a lot of in a minute was to these artists. Is these are, quote, inspirational objects in a display case in the Harry Hu exhibition at the Hyde Park Art Center in 1968, where that portrait of Jim was taken. Now, just to get into the popular culture a little bit more, in the 1930s and early 40s, it was the Great Depression. It was gloom, hardship, and deprivation. But the popular culture showed us extravagant musicals and screwball comedies. The situation comedy and comedy variety were the most dominant radio forms. We didn't quite have TV then. And risque novelty songs were very popular. In the 40s, you had World War II with young men being sent off to war and rationing and shortages and the beginning of nuclear fears. But you had screwball comedies and film noir dominating popular movies, situation and sketch comedies, the most popular TV shows, and novelty songs continued to be very, very popular. Then the 40s into the 50s, you got the Cold War, the McCarthy witch hunts, Hollywood and literary blacklists, paranoia and alienation. But in the popular culture, it's science fiction, horror, and fantasy films. It's the golden age of situation comedy on TV. In fact, there were personality-based shows, especially people like Milton Berle, who was characterized by rapid-fire, raucous, brash, and rowdy humor, where anything could and did happen. And at the peak of someone like Milton Berle, and I don't know if Jim and Carl personally watched Milton Berle, but at the Milton Berle's peak, 75% of the television sets in the United States would have been tuned in to see his show. And of course, you have I Love Lucy and all these other kind of shows dominating. And then novelty songs climb to #1 on the top of the charts. But the 50s, in the serious culture, are actually kind of grim and gloomy. And here you have the 3 sociological tracks that were trying to tell us about how bad things were and how alienated and awful people were. And all of you who watch Mad Men probably don't need a lot more information about this in particular. And then we have an artist like Ad Reinhardt drawing his famous cartoons that are actually terrible critiques of the burgeoning, American art scene. And this is called The Tree of Modern Art. It was published in a kind of communist magazine, PM magazine, in 1946. And just a detail there on the bottom, you see all the different corn pone artists, literally, growing out of a cornfield with all their sponsors like Container Corporation and Pepsi Cola. And in fact, you have Pepsi Cola, as a contest winner. I guess there was a contest that Pepsi Cola sponsored, just receiving derision from this high abstract expressionist artist, Ad Reinhardt. And the tree limb where all this dreck hangs from, like, the Mexican art influence and business as art patrons hangs, is almost cracking off. You can see where it's almost cracking off. But check out that big ant that's hanging there. That looks a lot like that earring that's in that Carl Worsum painting. So I just want to go quickly through a slide presentation in chronological order of the high art of the late 1940s and the 1950s. And I chose these all from the Metropolitan and the Art Institute. That was from the Met. This is from the Met, Jackson Pollock's work. This, Clifford Still, is from the Art Institute. So these are all public works. This is from the Met, the Franz Klein, William Basiotes. Even if the colors and the forms are a little bit more pleasant, you've got down titles like Flesh Eaters, or the Francis Bacon, which is at the Art Institute, Figure with Meat. Joan Mitchell, Pierre Manzoni at the Art Institute, and a Mark Rothko. So you got some really serious art here. This was the high art of the 50s. And whoops, who's coming in here? It's Claes Oldenburg performing Snapshots from the City in 1960. And I threw him in because there's so much attention to Oldenburg right now. But in the 1960s, we have Teenage Tyranny creeping in. And these are two popular paperbacks from that era that document the fact that we are, and I'm quoting, done in by palship and permissiveness in seeking to cope with our supercharged, pack-running teenagers. This book sounds of timely alarm to parents and educators and deserves a wide audience. So I guess we were really scared of teenagers back then, because they were reading stuff like this, Cracked magazine. This is the inaugural issue, which manages to parody both nuclear holocaust and Santa Claus on its cover. So by the late 1950s or early 1950s, the culture was really starting to crack up, literally. The kids who were kids during the war, the people born in the mid-30s like Nutt and Wirsum and Arneson and Saul, for them, World War II and its immediate aftermath was a time of somber deprivation that had followed on the somber deprivation of the Great Depression. These young people were really drawn to the popular culture, not the high art of the time. And I just wanted to look again at this painting, because what always strikes me about Jim's work are the borders. And where does this come from? Because this is something that is not terribly common in a lot of other people's work. And it is kind of, to me, coming out of the popular culture. Here's another example called Don't Touch Her, where the border becomes such a very interesting, different work when you take out the central image, although later on, he did a piece called Rumpled Dreams, where the central image becomes very abstract and the border becomes so highlighted. And when I was doing my research, I realized, oh, here's a 1910 National Geographic magazine. And it morphs into, I think, a 1961 National Geographic. Now start looking at the borders here. That's completely taken up by this cracked inaugural issue with the yellow border, which is faded, with all the figures going on. Duplicated again by Mad Magazine, and that was Alfred E. Newman there on the cover, so that you have what is very essential to the identification of these popular culture magazines are these borders with all these different little drawings and friezes and things around them. So quickly, I've got a lot of material here, and I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. But, this was the great time of consumerism. So you had ads all over the place, and I know all these artists were very influenced by, especially the girdle ads. You see a lot of that. But you have a big TV figure like Arthur Godfrey with this, unless you're a nudist, come in and get a Helmac, which is a lint picker up off your clothes. But for many of the girdle ads and underwear ads, the women actually wear leotards, although this woman's modestly hiding her braziered breasts behind her arms. So you have this really spectrum of modesty and sort of raunchiness. And just visually, these are homemade products, mostly for African Americans. The toys of the time were so influenced by cartoons. And this in particular struck me because in the corner here of this installation view of the Harry Hoo exhibition, the DuPont Center in Washington, D.C., you have this little toy lawnmower stuck back there, which is very cartoony looking. But even just the stuff that you would have seen at these temporary tattoos, you think temporary tattoos are a new thing? No. These are from the 40s, and they show all these sort of patriotic things, including, airplanes buzzing around, that you see being used as tattoos on the bodies of many of Jim's, especially his characters. And then this just amazing, I don't know if Jim and Carl ever saw this, but I thought this was just one of the best things, and it did have this border thing going on. But to get back to comics, and I do know that comics were especially important to Carl. These are two comics that were coming out in the late 40s. The Fritzy Ritz is actually the predecessor of Nancy. Fritzy Ritz was a sexy woman who turns later to be the sort of staid aunt of taking care of Nancy. And it's basically a kind of parody strip. And the Fearless Fosdick is a parody of Dick Tracy. And you can see just the grotesque violence done in the sense of humor here going on down there from the Little Abner comics. And Little Abner becomes important here in just a minute. And again, another Nancy, another comic book displayed in the Made in Chicago Some Resources exhibition. And I just, here comes that desert scene again. So they're already, talking about this popular culture stuff, which done over and over again. But we have that same sort of drawing style of the vomit and the gagging for air that you see in the Nancy strip. And Nancy is just so weird. I don't know what that is. Is that a ring back there, or a spaceship? A little green man, I guess. And then that Una. It's a moon ring. Okay. A mood ring? Mood ring? Okay. And then the pulp fiction of the time. Plastic Man, stretching out everywhere. And we see so much stretching and elongation in the art of this whole group, especially in Jim Nutt and Gladys Nilsson's work. And this Plastic Man was a fictional comic book superhero, of course, and Crime Does Not Pay, one of the popular pulp figures there, pulp magazines. And then these amazing, thrilling wonder stories with these bulgy-eyed, brightly colored aliens. And see the arms, the tentacles on that creature? Very Gladys Nilsson-esque. Just more examples of the very creative artworks that were just all around these young people growing up in these years. And two magazines that Carl has particularly said were important to him, Frontline Combat and Tales from the Crypt, because of the drawing style. I know Jim Nutt is very influenced by film noir, and the posters of film noir movies at that time, just done in these amazing, highlighted, strange, surreal, almost over-the-top, well, let's say it, they're over-the-top kind of graphic styles that make people look very different from what they look like in real life. The horror movie posters, the insects, you see the small people, the big people. This is one of my favorites, the horror of Dracula with this very strange face there in the middle. And I like the little inset images. Though you see that a lot in the popular culture materials of the time. And then on the more serious magazines, like Life magazine, you have all these sort of beautiful women that are being portrayed. But wait, you'll see what's going on here. We have this guy, Basil Wolverton, who I know a lot of New York critics like to say that Jim was influenced by him. And when I first read this, I ran to Jim and I said, "That's not true, is it?" And Jim said, "No, not really. He was not terribly influenced by Basil Wolverton." But what happened with, All right, here we go. Something happened. I thought we had a power outage. What happened was that the Little Abner comic strip wanted to get the ugliest woman in the world, and they did a whole contest, and Basil Wolverton actually came up with the ugliest woman in the world. Her name was Lynne the hyena, and you saw her in that previous strip. But this was out there in the culture. I don't think Jim saw Basil. He said he didn't. But I think Basil saw Life magazine covers, because here you have a cover done by Basil Wolverton, and then you have all these women that were young starlets on the black and white cover of Life with these big teeth, and this is what Basil was looking at. So I don't know if we're going full circle or not, but. And just to quickly go through, again, some of the popular culture, these novelty songs were really important. Itsy Bitsy Teeny Weeny, Yellow Polka Dot Bikini. This is an album cover from a Harry Belafonte album where he sang Banana Boat Song, and you've got these very graphic, cartoony kind of figures. And of course, the Purple People Eater. Nothing was too weird for the novelty song album cover illustrators. And 2 comedy movie posters, which is one of my favorite movie titles ever, a Judy Holliday movie. And then Alec Guinness's Lady Killers with this, very odd graphic style, cartoon style showing there. Now, Carl definitely said that Mad Magazine was important to him, but early on when it was more like a comic strip. And here you see that sort of comic strip back of the magazine, stuff you can buy, including, Alfred E. Newman there and that whole group of figures, and your compressed air torpedo that you could buy. And again, that's sort of the fun catalog stuff, all these visual motifs that were just floating out there and certainly imprinting themselves in the brains of all these young men, some of whom became artists. But I particularly liked this image here, which is a cut face. And it looks so much like both the cutting my eye tooth image and some of the Jim Nutt distortions of the face that it's just kind of interesting to point out. Or your classic jokes with your whoopee cushion and, the finger with the nail going through it. You start seeing the picture here, right? Of how this visual culture, I think, really supported this jokey imagery that was so strong in early Nutt and Wirsum. My favorite, the amazing wrist radio. And speaking of sexuality, the stocking stick leg makeup. Now, Mad Magazine also did something really interesting. It made these parody labels. Now, this was a page in Mad Magazine, and what you were supposed to do, children at home, is cut these out and put them over the actual products. And they were just laid out so that you could cut them out. So you have, Rush Up and King Size Cancer cigarettes, and the pineapple that becomes Dice. So instead of Dole, Roll, Las Vegas Pineapple. And then Cracked Magazine also did some of these where you actually get to color them in. But again, this wordplay, this punning thing was very much around in the culture. It was something that was the appeal to that sort of zany, satirical sense of humor that was emerging. And then we have Andy Warhol. And it's so interesting to see the sort of high art of this time is actually kind of dull, because when you have these artists taking from the popular culture, appropriating it, but not really interested in the essence of the actual thing, the way the Harry Who artists were, it just becomes very rigorous and sort of formal, and you can talk about it at length with all sorts of ideas that I don't think are nearly as lively as the Harry Who. And then this famous Roy Lichtenstein Girl with Ball, which he took from a poster that you saw, but I think it was actually Lucy Ball. I think all the art historians have it wrong, that it wasn't so much that Poconos Resort poster that was the important thing. It was Lucille Ball, because the mouth is actually much more similar to Lucy there. See? And this taking photographs and drawing from them was something that all the pulp people did too. Many of the cartoonists would just go pose quickly and do a snapshot and then sit down and draw. So again, you know, the sort of high pop art that Imagism or the Harry Who are often called pop artists, this stuff starts looking a little dry compared to our friends here in Chicago. And I just wanted to, you know, show you. You see the Dole. He should have put the parody label on it. It would have been much more culturally relevant. And just to quickly, I just did want to stress that it was outliers in the culture who were not all in Chicago. There were others who were in other cities, like Peter Saul, who actually was in Paris during the formative years and writes about an aha moment where he was at a magazine stand and found a copy of Mad Magazine. Suddenly, he was given permission to really do what I think he wanted to do all along, which was draw in this very cartoony sort of manner. And again, an icebox or refrigerator painting, which is so, you know, volatile after seeing that Tom Wesselmann, which is also a sort of kitchen portrait. The cartoon references are rife in Peter Saul, and any one of these people could have a much longer lecture on it. I'm really just skimming over the top of a lot of things. But you see the similar sensibility coming out of this sort of elongated limbs, these cartoons, the black outlines, the puns, the humor, but all towards satire. And again, in Saul, it's more the satire of the political and the authorities in our culture, it's particularly the military here, but it's also satire about entertainment itself. And here it's just talking about sexuality, pretty obvious what's going on with Superman here. Yep. Crime does not pay. And then Robert Arneson, this just lovely little piece that I saw out at the Stanford Art Museum called His and Her. And this is a bad slide, but it's basically his and her toilets, again, with the, you know, sexual characteristics forming the back of the toilets in both of these. And I just thought this was kind of an interesting way to end my talk here today of Robert Arneson's assassination of famous nut artist. And it's a self-portrait, of course, of Arneson, but I kind of like the famous nut artist as well, because Arneson was definitely tuned into what was going on in Chicago. And when he was asked about his work, he definitely would refer to, as he put it, the Chicago artist, Harry Who types that deal with imagery right out of the comics. So I hope this hasn't been too fast a trip through this material, and if you do have questions, we will be available for them later. And thank you very much.